Now, there are many, many factors which contribute to this phenomenon of failure to launch. And I just touch on a whole bunch of them in this program. I'm not going to get through this whole presentation today because there's just so much information. It is on Vimeo, or if you want to see the whole presentation, it's called Parenting for Tomorrow. And I'll put this one up too. This is kind of an abbreviated version of the longer talk. Okay? So, who is this talk designed for? It's designed mostly for people who are going to be parents or who are young parents. That's predominantly because this is where we need to start. If you want your kid to grow up and to be healthy, and for our generation, we're talking about our grandkids, okay, because none of us are in the little kid stage anymore. But we're talking about our grandchildren, but not, so it's not just for the young parents, it's for grandparents who have the ability to have some say in how their grandchildren are raised. Now, some of us don't have the best relationship with our children, so we can't just dictate stuff, but in love we can offer advice and direct them to resources so that they can, because if they follow the model that our society has laid down, it's probably going to end in failure. Because that's the biggest problem, is that the accepted model for raising children is so bad that we are producing out failure to launch children in record amounts. The topic I call Parenting for Tomorrow, and it's people get the idea that we're going to be talking about how to prepare your children for the careers of tomorrow. This has virtually nothing to do with that. Again, as I mentioned before, this is about failure to launch adults. Producing young people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who cannot separate from home. Okay. Now, sometimes there are, I have a brain injury clinic too, and I treat people with chronic illnesses. That's different, okay, than somebody who has no chronic illness. They've not had any brain trauma, and yet they're very happy staying at home, eating their parents' food, not contributing anything, not working toward an education, and not working at anything meaningful. No volunteer work. They essentially watch television and play video games. And they're happy with that lifestyle. Okay? So this is what we want to avoid if we can. Now, when people have children, I tell the young parents, when you find out that you're pregnant, you imagine what the future is going to be like. And we always put the best face on it, okay? Oh, this is wonderful. My child will grow up. They're going to graduate from high school and go to college, graduate from college, go off, get married. We're going to have lovely grandchildren, and they'll come on the holidays and visit, and it's going to be wonderful. We'll have that white picket fence existence. And that's how it's going to be. And then, when we get really old, we can move in with them, So, I mean, look at all this great plan. How wonderful it is to have children. All right. A mother's dream is to see her children grow to be healthy, happy, and successful. I think both parents want that. Now, that's very general, though. Specifically, when you sit down and think about it, what do we want for our kids? Ideally, if you could sit down and make a list of ideally what you want for your kids, it would look something like this. You want them to be intellectually competent and resourceful. What does it mean to be resourceful? It means if you're facing a problem, you know where to go to get it fixed, and it's not mom and dad, okay? You understand what resources are available to solve your problems, okay? And that includes the Lord, by the way, all right? Capacity for delayed gratification. Okay, if you want to really know what cuts people's life short, the number one thing that cuts people's lives short today is inability to do delayed gratification. I want to feel good, and I want to feel good now. Heroin works, okay? Heroin works, cocaine works, alcohol works, sex works. These are things that give you immediate gratification to feel good now. However, it's going to cost you, in some cases, your life. Okay, capacity for delayed gratification. If you want your kid to be successful, if they don't get a handle on this, then forget about having a fulfilled, happy life. I've got a couple, and I'm treating the mom, and it's a very difficult case, very, very difficult case, because the severity, she's having severe depression, severe anxiety, because their only son has been recently found guilty of sex crimes. And he's still in the home. He's not been sentenced yet, but they know what the future is. I mean, everything they had, sending him to college, all that stuff is now completely worthless. He's going to be spending the next 10 to 15 years in prison, and even when he comes out with being a sex offender, forget about getting a job. So all of their dreams for that kid are over because he hooked up with a 13-year-old girl on the internet. Okay, it's all done. He's finished. Okay, and she's freaking out. They gave him affection and everything, but without capacity for delayed gratification, it's potentially worthless.
How old is he?
Worthless. How is he now? 32. Okay. All right. So he's done. So, and a lot of people don't understand that. They wink. My best friend in high school, his father thought he was giving him something really cool. For his 18th birthday, he gave him a bunch of porn magazines. Within 1 year, he went out and got some girl pregnant, and that was the end of his education right there. And it's like, capacity for delayed gratification will derail more people than anything on this list. So if you want your kid to be successful, self-control is extremely important. And if you want them to grow up and have any type of spiritual life, it's very important as well. Otherwise, if people get stuck in this area, then spiritual maturity becomes very difficult because they get stuck in this loop over and over again. If they're not growing in this area, then it makes spiritual growth very hard. Emotional resilience. Life is full of disappointment, pain, and loss. Every time you're threatened with a disappointment, a pain, or a loss, if we're freaking out and giving up and threatening suicide, that's not a good thing. When we experience losses, losses are changes. Disappointments are life changes. And with God, every threat that we face is a potential to see God help us. It's a potential to see what God can do for us and to grow our faith. And if people crumble every time they face a loss, if they don't turn to God, if instead they just, they threaten suicide or they go off and do something drastic, then that's going to ruin their lives. And we see this quite a bit. And then personal fulfillment, enough love and belonging, enough purpose, enough respect, including self-respect, enough freedom from excessive manipulation, and enough positive emotion. In other words, we want them to have enough personal fulfillment. This is what we want for our kids. Stable, healthy, reasonably happy, and fulfilled without being derailed by the pitfalls. Now, the original title that I had in mind was How Not to Make Your Kids Retarded, but that was shot down. And when I say retarded here, what I mean is not retarded in the pejorative sense. Okay, they used to call kids with autism that, and I don't mean it in that sense. I mean retarded like, say, for example, you're growing a fig tree. If you grow it in the wild, fig trees can get pretty big. However, if you're growing it on your patio when there's a roof up here, well, you're going to limit. You've got how deep are your roots going to be, and how high can your leaves go? So you've retarded the growth of this fig tree. It had the potential to be massive, and it's going to not live up to its potential because it has been retarded by the environment. And so that's what I was referring to by how not to make your children retarded. There are developmental factors that handicap or stimulate the developing brain. Very, very complicated process. When you take a look at what happens to that child's brain, the brain is not finished growing and maturing until around 25. Okay? So you're still a child until 25. I tell a lot of people who say, I just want to take a break. I got a couple years of college. I think I'll take a few years off and then come back. And I always say the same thing. Don't do it. I'm warning you right now. Don't do it. The reason I say that is because when you are still young, before the age of 25, your ability to learn new things is at its peak. You can learn brand new languages and brand new things that you never knew before the age of 25. And it's the easiest it's going to be for your life. Now, once you have gotten the basics in your head, you can build on that so your IQ can continue to grow until you get to be about 65. Okay? I've got a couple years left. Okay? But your IQ can continue to grow until then. But when it comes to learning new information, 25 is your cutoff. You can still learn new stuff, but it's going to be a lot harder. Take advantage of that developmental stuff there. Now, the other thing, too, is that as it's developing, if anything gets in the way, such as exposure to stress, too much stress, or toxins, or poor nutrition, then it can adversely affect the developing brain. Talking about developmental factors that influence the developing brain, I'm not talking about genetic factors, because there are many genetic factors. I'm talking about epigenetic factors, or things outside of the genes that can affect development. Too many people in their head, even though they haven't verbalized it, their attitude reflects their expectation. The expectation is, hey, I'm the parent. My job is to go to work and provide for food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. That's the parent's job. These other things, intellectual enlightenment, social integration, entertainment, spiritual and moral values, I'm leaving it to the schools for this. And TV, okay? So television, entertainment, schools take care of this stuff. This is my job. And I'm a good parent as long as I take care of this. And to be a buddy to my child, just, hey, I'll be here, go for it, What I'm saying is that, that this is incorrect, this is incomplete, and that is inappropriate and will result in more failures to launch children than anything. There are many things that parents are responsible for. But what I mean is that if we want our kids to grow up and achieve those 5 things that we talked about, or that list of things that we talked about, we need to provide the presence or absence of these things will make a huge difference. Parental nurturance. What is parental nurturance? So, holding that child when they're a baby, conveying enough affection, picking them up when they're crying and consoling them, smiling back at them when they smile at you, giving them adequate attention to show that they're worthy of love. Very important. And positive reinforcement. Give them a good attaboy, good job. Those things are very important as well. But not only is it important to provide adequate nurturance, discipline is just as important, if not sometimes more. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the large part, most of today's talk, is how important that is. Of course, food, shelter, and medical treatment, that goes without saying. Protection from predators. How many of my adult patients, women especially, but not only women, sometimes men as well, basically a predator, usually a family member, molest the kid before they're 18 years old. That happens. It's outrageous how common it is. And it's not punished severely enough, in my opinion. The damage that it does is absolutely amazing. It does not just damage to that child, but to that child's spouse and future family. I mean, it's one of those. It's one of the worst things you can do to a kid, because you affect an army of people, not just one person. So, loss of self-control in that one area, socially, it's a dirty bomb that goes off and affects a lot of people. It is absolutely disgusting. It's horrible, the amount of damage that it does. So protection from predators. Know what's going on in your kid's life, who they're hanging out with, any strange relatives hanging around, any suspicious activity. Listen carefully. When the kid says, Uncle Bob took me back, that you better pay attention and don't say, oh, I know that didn't happen. Just ignore it. No. That needs to be addressed. And also modeled social values, modeled morality. If the parents are modeling immoral values, if they're modeling negative behaviors, then that's going to be, their children are going to catch that more than they're going to do what you say. And then cognitive stimulation. They need to respect you intellectually. People who leave it up to the schools to do all the teaching, when they get to be teenagers, they're going to see you as a dummy. Okay? That's why it's very important that you engender respect. And a lot of times what happens is many Christian parents mean well by telling their children, do what I tell you and don't ask questions. However, if you can't explain any rationale as to why we do what we do, later on they're going to turn on you in a big way. That's just manipulative after a while. And so early on, there needs to be, honey, this is why we do it this way. Explain it, and you'll get a lot more mileage out of that than just saying, do what I say, because I'm the boss. I'm the boss. See, the Bible says I'm the boss of you, so there you go. Okay, that's not going to fly very well. I'll start with nutrition. I want to briefly talk about that because we've discussed this here already. But in the past, up until really the mid-60s, the American diet, most people lived in a rural setting in the United States until 1960. And in those settings, we ate a much broader variety of animals. We weren't that wealthy, and so we ate what we could catch a lot of times. And so we ate, in addition to cows and buffalo and elk and deer and sheep and goats and rabbits, we ate a bunch of animals that spent all day grazing on grass. And grass is the source of omega-3 fatty acids. The two sources of omega-3s are grass and algae, okay? So fish eat animals that eat algae, so fish body oil has omega-3s, and animals that eat grass have omega-3s. Omega-3s are necessary for neuroplasticity and for the production of adequate serotonin. When serotonin is elevated, when we have good serotonergic tone in our brains, it gives us the ability to feel contentment. It's the opposite of restless. Restlessness is behind both depression and anxiety. And so having adequate serotonin production is important. So in the 1970s, when the farmers stopped feeding their cows grass and only gave them grain, and people stopped eating goats and deer and all these other animals, it drastically reduced the consumption of omega-3s in the American population, and we saw depression and anxiety rates skyrocket, except in groups that were eating lots of fish. That's why we recommend to everybody that comes in here with a mood problem, you need to be supplementing with omega-3s, including children, especially children, okay? Very important. Now, what we're seeing is an explosion of attention deficit disorder, and it's important to talk about that. To launch people have attention deficit as a diagnosis as well. Now people want to think of that, oh, it's genetic, I got it from so and so, my uncle had it, whatever, and it's all genetic. No, it's not all genetic. Now you can have certain genetic predispositions, but having the genes doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have the malady. There are definitely traits outside of the person, outside of their genes, that also influence it, okay? So we do have some heritability. These are some genes that are implicated in attention deficit. But in addition to the genes, several other things are important, okay? At least 1/3 of all fathers who had ADHD in their youth bear children who have ADHD. And the majority of identical twins share the trait. So there is a genetic component, but it goes beyond that.
Would you say that males are more susceptible?
Little bit, but you can specifically, when males have it, you tend to see the hyperactivity more often than you do in the women. Women have it, but theirs is mostly inattentive form. Occasionally you see the hyperactive as well. Okay. All right, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder characterized by problems paying attention, being excessively hyperactive, difficulty controlling behaviors. They have a thought of something to do and they do it without thinking, and then later, oops. Okay, these are symptoms of attention deficit disorder, and these are, these behaviors are controlled by mostly the anterior prefrontal cortex. Okay, that's very much involved. Now, problems paying attention leads to school problems. I mean, trying to get them to do homework is very difficult. Just focusing their attention on the teacher droning on and on, it's very difficult to follow that, because it's just, they're easily distracted and they have trouble paying attention. Now, when it comes to tasks that they enjoy, very often they don't have problems. When they're playing video games, watching cartoons, it's okay. But when it's things that require sustained mental effort, that's not fun, those are the things that are different. Now, some people, especially some parents, will look at that and say, he doesn't have ADD. He can play that stupid video game for hours. Yet you try to get him to stay on task for something like this, and they can't do it. What's the difference between the two? Okay, there is a difference. When you take a look at an activity that there is some fun, an element of fun, then what happens is that your motivation circuits kick in, and that helps you pay attention, because you're motivated to do it because there is a fun factor. And so where these people most likely have problems are in tasks that do not result in immediate reward. That's where they're having trouble. And the problem is that how many jobs are there that are fun? See, we wouldn't call it work if it was fun. So that the ability to continue playing a video game is pretty worthless in the work world, okay? It will get you very, there's nothing there, okay? Now, why is it important to treat? Because if the kid continues like this, then they develop very quickly, they develop the attitude of, I hate school. I hate it. It's like prison. I hate it. And once they've gone down that pathway, you end up with something called loss of academic self-efficacy. Now, some of you have always had academic self-efficacy. From the time you're in kindergarten, you've always done well in school, and whenever presented with a new assignment, it's like, okay, I've done this stuff before, I'll do this, and you get through just fine. Okay? I did not. I was a lousy student all through elementary school, and my teachers always says, has lots of potential, but he's a loser. I mean, essentially. You know, and I was all that way. Part of it was my handwriting was so horrible. They just think you're an idiot. You know, back then, if you had bad handwriting, you're an idiot too. So I was just.
Or a doctor.
Yeah. Well, I had nothing good, and I hated school. I don't think I had ADHD, but I was just very bored with the whole thing, and I hated anything. And then in 7th grade, I remember my 7th grade science teacher. She had a PhD in boring, okay, and she made science painful. I got an E in science in 7th grade, and that's when, you know, I got sat down by my parents, and my father had a belt in his hand, and that really, you know, yeah, because back then it was like I was not given the option. It's like, okay, these grades are really bad, you know, and blah blah blah. And we only said it with lots of profanity, okay, and lots of threats, you know. And so that's around the time, shortly after that, I accepted Christ. And one of the first things I did after accepting Christ is, you know, I'm really stupid and I need some help here, okay? I need to work on these grades. And now, it didn't work out ideally the way you'd think, because I started out learning, you know, the first thing I learned was, you know what? If I write on my hand, I can do better on tests. So I learned to cheat, you know, and that was the first thing is I started, you know, in 8th grade, I'll never forget, you know, it's in math class stuff, I'll write the formulas down here, and I said, oh, wow, you know, and then the new good grades started coming in. He says, wow, this is really great. It feels good to not get E's and D's. And it's like, I like the feeling of this. And then after a while, I realized I was spending more time preparing all these stupid notes, and half the time I wasn't even looking anymore. And I says, you know what? How about I can do this without the cheating? And that's how it worked. And I experienced for the first time, I was in 8th grade before I felt academic self-efficacy. Okay, and it basically, you know, it changed. Academically, it completely altered my future. Having that sense that I can do it matters tremendously. It affects their whole future, and so that's why ADHD is so bad. If they never get this, and that's why people say, should I give my kid medicine or what? And I says, well, you don't have to start with meds, but if we can't do it any other way, then go ahead and use them, because one thing you don't want is the loss of academic self-efficacy. They need to understand that, yes, you can do it. It's not scary. It's not bad. Because loss of academic self-efficacy turns into job efficacy, you know, and that affects their ability to escape mom's basement. Okay. So, children with ADHD often turn to adults with ADHD that demonstrate chronic problems with being able to focus attention, organize their work, sustained effort, the ability to continue working on a problem even through the difficult parts, trouble utilizing working memory. These are all problems with attention deficit. Inhibiting impulsive actions. Now, many people with ADHD don't have this. This is something that many children will grow out of, that impulsivity, and when they don't, that's really horrible, because then they end up, you know, likely to go to jail or dead, because they, you know, oh, I'll try some of that. Is that a mushroom? Give me one of those. You know, they are likely to do something impulsive and get themselves into serious trouble. But again, most people with attention deficit do grow out of this one, but if not, it can be really devastating. Now, what's happened, because this is the big issue, can't discuss ADHD without thinking about this question. is it really going up in the population, or has it always been as it is now? Because now, all of you know somebody with ADHD, or you know of a family of kids. Everybody in here knows. It's so common. When I was in elementary school, it was not a thing. Nobody heard of it before. Did it exist back then? It did, but the incidence has gone up a bit. The first report where people started getting concerned about the increased incidence, DJ Safer was the first one to report on it. And what he noted was that from 1991 to 2009, he looked at prescriptions for psychostimulants, okay? Ritalin, Adderall, and so forth. And he says, let's follow that, because these are the drugs that are mostly used to treat attention deficit. So if you look at the incidence in 91 at pharmacy prescriptions, and then you look at it in 2009, it went up tenfold, 1,000%. And it's not just in this country. It rose in every developed country. Michael Sawyer is an investigator down there in Australia, and they noticed the same thing. It's like, what is going on here? And he's like, suddenly, it's not like the population increased tenfold, all right? The population didn't increase tenfold. We don't have 5 billion people in the United States now. What is going on here? Why did it go up tenfold? And so one of the theories was, you know what? Them bad doctors, those lazy doctors are just giving this diagnosis out like it's water, and they are responsible for this. It's the doctor's fault because they're over-diagnosing attention deficit. And so what they did was they looked at some criteria where they took a big sample of students who had the diagnosis of ADHD, and they actually went in and they interviewed them and their teachers to find out, okay, do they really have it? So these kids, they pulled them out of the survey, and they looked at the children who were on the stimulants, then they interviewed those kids and their teachers to know, do they really meet criteria for ADHD, or did the doctors just slap this on them haphazardly? What did they discover? Well, the fact was that 2% of all the kids in Australia had true ADHD, and the ones that were given the diagnosis actually had the illness. They really did meet criteria. They really met criteria. And so then another part of the exam was, okay, what factors are true of families that have children with attention deficit disorder? What are some of the things that are true of the families that have kids who manifest this trait? And interestingly, the one thing that stood out bigger than any other variable was they came from single parent or blended families. That was the biggest factor that these people had in common. Now, up until this time, a lot of physicians believed that this was due to genetic factors, or maybe iron deficiency, or some type of, a thyroid deficiency, just some type of problem along those lines. Nobody was really thinking seriously about family factors. And so that was really puzzling. It's like, seriously? Coming from a family where you don't have the biological parents together, is that really a risk for attention deficit? This kind of surprised everybody. So other investigators got involved, and Lisa Stroshine, hers was a really important study. She basically said, okay, let's think about this. If this is true, if having the parents separate, the biological parents separate, if that really does increase the risk for attention deficit, we should be able to see that. We can concoct a study to look and see if that's the case. And she developed this brilliant study. Now, she's Canadian, and so she used the resources of the Canadian registry there. And what she basically did was she used data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, and she said the study began in 1994, and they enrolled about many like 5,000, was it 5,000? Yeah, about 5,000 Canadian people, and so 5,000 Canadian children from all these different families. Now, all of these children that were enrolled in 1994 were from two-parent families where the biological parents were all together. Okay, so it started out, all 5,000 children have two biological parents, and then in 2000, 6 years later, they said, okay, how many of these people still have their parents? Well, 13% of the kids, their parents had divorced. Okay? So 633 kids. And so what Strostein said is, okay, let's compare. Let's compare the kids that lost their parents into divorce versus the kids that didn't. Is there any increased risk of ADHD in that 6-year period? Okay? So none of the kids had ADHD in 1994. Okay? None of them did. So now you're going to look at 2000 and say, okay, what happened to the kids that for the parents stayed together versus the parents that got divorced? Is there a difference? Well, of the children whose parents stayed together, 3 out of 100, or 3.3% of them, ended up being diagnosed with ADHD. So 3.3% of the kids whose parents stayed together were diagnosed with ADD versus 6.1% of the parents who divorced. That is, it's almost doubled. Statistically, that was out of the park. Okay? So what that shows is just in that 6-year period, the risk of becoming attention deficit disordered with parents who were not together, who separated during that period, the risk was doubled. Okay? So then, why? Why? Why would it do that? Why would the biological parents separating double the risk of the kids come down with ADHD? Well, one of the first things people thought of, well, people that divorce, there's a lot of parental conflict. They're yelling at each other. That's a stressor, and we know that exposure to stressful things can affect children cognitively. Okay? Good parenting requires a lot of skills, like being a president. You need to have a lot of control. You need to have patience. You need to be able to pay attention to your kid. You need to plan. If you want your child to have a good future, you need to plan for things. And then problem solving. These are all things that are important. Okay? You have to have, if you're going to be a parent, patience is extremely important. Impatient people do a lot of damage. Now, this subject here, patience is important even before birth. When psychiatry was first invented, going back to the Freud days, remember Freud just blamed the mom for everything. Okay? And then we got into the 70s and the 80s, and they reversed on that. Said, no. And then 90s says, yep. Okay, it's like we're back to we made a full circle. Now we're back to this. Actually, the mom is responsible for more than we ever thought. Okay, all right. Now this is really not good news. Okay, this is not good news. This says, wow, when a woman is pregnant, if she is experiencing a lot of maternal stress, a lot of anxiety, it will affect the child's IQ. It literally will lower your kids' IQ scores, it lowers their SAT scores. Okay? So, what are things to avoid in pregnancy? Too much stress, and then sometimes if you have a stressful job, it might be a good idea to not, okay? Because it could do that, it could do damage. So stress is one thing. Another thing to avoid in pregnancy is infection. Anything that makes your immune system go up is bad. Anything that causes inflammation is bad. If a woman is infected with bacterial infections, fungal infections, viral infections, that raises the risk of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, autism, all of those. And this is a known thing now, okay? Any of these, so bad. Maternal obesity, especially if sugar is involved, if any changes in sugar. Women who experience gestational diabetes, that affects the overall body habits of the child, increased inflammation in the baby, and not only puts the child at risk for obesity, but also other psychiatric problems. And so this is a really, in the old days, they went so far as if you were pregnant, they didn't want you looking at bad things. There was that protective. In other countries, they still do that. And so it's like, the idea was, protect the mother, because they were like supernatural about the things that could affect the babies. But we've almost gone full circle. It says, you know what? Maybe we should still be doing that, because those factors do affect the child, and mom needs to be protected. Protecting mom in pregnancy is akin to protecting the future of that child. Okay? All right, so parents need attention to that child, planning, you're reading to the child before they can even talk, because that still helps stimulate them cognitively. Problem solving, and if you don't know if you need problem solving, you've never had a teenager. And so when parents divorce, they're not at their best. Okay? And so these areas are kind of negative. So that's one factor. Now, Brandy and Nig, this is a study out of Michigan State. Actually, Brandy works in this area now, but they're both from Michigan State. And they asked the question, well, since separation of the parents has this effect, what are the actual, because, the piece of paper, we are now divorced, that's not doing it. What is it about the parenting style in families where the parents divorce? How does that change how the people interact with their kids? What are the differences? And this study was published in 2009, and it was extremely informative. Okay, and so they specifically looked at what are the parenting practices in families where there's ADHD versus, and with families, with ADHD versus families where none of the kids have ADHD, okay? And they use something called the Alabama Parenting Questionnaire. And I actually printed off 2 copies so I could show you, and of course forgot them on the printer, so. Okay. It's a 7-page questionnaire that you give to the parents. And so you're taking the parents' word for how they raise their kid, okay? And so they compared. So they did an interview with all the kids, making sure they had ADHD versus not. And then they used the Alabama Parenting Questionnaire among all these 633 parents to figure out, okay, how are you raising your kids, or the parents of the 633 kids. Anyway, here's what the results were. Okay, oh, I'm sorry, wrong number. It's 181 kids. Okay. All right. So they looked at families without ADHD versus families with ADHD, looking at the results of the Alabama questionnaire. And here's what they discovered. In the families where the children ended up with ADHD, the most associated factor was inconsistent parental discipline. What does that mean? Consistent parental discipline means we have set guidelines in this family. If you do this, there will be consequences, and I will follow up on it. Inconsistent is either there's no guidelines, or if there are guidelines, I only meet the guidelines sometimes. Yeah, you might get grounded, you might not. You might get a spanking, you might not. Okay? I might just ignore it. Depends what kind of mood I'm in. All right? So families with ADHD, we saw parental inconsistent discipline, and the second most common was low paternal involvement. Okay? These were the factors. The worse these were, the greater the incidence of attention deficit disorder. Now, why is that? Why low paternal involvement? Well, as you know, if you get divorced in most Western countries, the father kind of gets cut out of the picture. You get to be a visitor and you get to provide money, but you really don't do much parenting except on weekends, and that kind of doesn't count. Okay? Because anything, you're gonna, if you do discipline more harshly than the child likes, they go back and complain to the mom, and then you got a custody battle and all that kind of nonsense, okay? And so dad kind of gets out of the picture, and so many fathers just say, you know what, since I'm not the real dad, since the stepdad is the new guy, I'm just gonna bow out, see ya, okay? And either they turn Disneyland fathers, or they just vacate altogether. That happens. 63% of youth suicides are from families where there's no dad. 85% of children with oppositional defiant disorder, these were the juvenile delinquents, 85% come from fatherless homes. 80% of male rapists come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions. 85% of men in prisons come from fatherless homes. Okay? So that plays, when the paternal involvement goes down, it invites quite a bit of trouble. So paternal low involvement is self-explanatory. Why inconsistent discipline following divorce? When you're in marriage, people usually get married for a reason. We have a need for love and belonging, and everybody recognizes that. And when your spouse, who was your principal source of love and belonging, is now you're now persona non grata with that person, okay? No longer are you getting any love and belonging, or you wouldn't be getting divorced, right? And so what happens is that people look to their kids to fill in the void. And so instead of being a parent, which is kind of an adversarial relationship, you end up looking to be a friend. And so what happens is that nobody is going to be the disciplinarian. And this happens very commonly. And so when you take consistent discipline out of the equation, the increased risk of attention deficit goes up. More time spent in daycare and babysitters and so forth. So what happens is that when you have parents that are together, you're more likely to have an authoritative or an authoritarian parenting style. Now, what does that mean? There are 4 types of parenting style. One is authoritarian. That's what most of us had when we grew up. Most of us who grew up in the 60s grew up under authoritarian parents, whereas they laid down the rules. If you violated the rules, there were swift and severe consequences.
If you got caught.
There you go. You learned to lie. I did. Okay, you learned to lie a lot because telling the truth, the fear was the swift and terrible consequences. Not a lot of explanation as to why you were supposed to do what you did. You just did it because you were told to, and that was the way it was. Not a lot of nurturance. Enough nurturance to make you turn out okay, but a lot of when things were bad, they let you know you were a bad kid. Now, the benefit of that is that when you were introduced to Christianity and you understood that Jesus forgave you all your sins, that guilt that they gave you, you had something to be thankful for. And one of the problems with children that have no authoritarian or authoritative parenting is that they don't understand that they do things wrong. There is no appropriate guilt. Okay, and so one of the benefits of having a parent point out your bad behavior is that it develops a healthy sense of appropriate guilt. You should feel guilty about being greedy. You should feel guilty about being lazy. You should feel guilty about being deceptive and mean and cruel. Okay, these are things that you should call a spade a spade. Okay, and people when they get away from authoritarian and authoritative parenting, they don't do that. Everything you do is good. You're a good person. You're over and over again, and the kids are going, so why do I feel bad? And they grow up with low self-esteem, not understanding why they feel bad sometimes. Okay? So authoritarian, strict parenting, no convincing the child why adults are right. Okay? Now, there's also authoritarian, authoritative parenting. Now, authoritative parenting is where you give a lot of nurturance and control and discipline. And so discipline is there, and it's consistent, but you also give plenty of nurturance. Oh, that's authoritarian. Okay, this is authoritative there. And so this is the best blend, all right? And then you have what is most common is indulgent or permissive parenting. So there's lots of, oh, honey, you're wonderful, you're great, I love you, you didn't do anything wrong. There's that, but there's very little self-regulation. Okay, and so so if there is discipline, it's inconsistent. And then there's the worst one, which is disengaged or irresponsible parenting. These are people that just pop out kids and basically they're on their own. And you find, certainly in poor communities you're going to find a lot of that, and certainly you do. But you know what? Not always. I've seen this in the wealthy as well, where they're so caught up in their jobs that nobody's raising the kids. And it's horrible. These kids are at home doing all kinds of horrible things. And the parents are totally oblivious. They're so into their jobs that their children are growing up feral, okay? And they're literally growing up good for nothing because they are raised in an irresponsible, disengaged manner. Okay? Now, today, our culture is anti-authoritarian, big time. It's like, oh, it's the worst thing. Oh my gosh. Don't discipline your child. Don't be consistent with discipline. Everything you need to just tell your child that they're wonderful all the time, and don't give any value judgments. Well, and so what they do then is that if you Google authoritarian parenting, you see all this negative stuff. Oh, it's so bad for you. It's so bad for you. Don't do that to your kids. Well, let's see how bad it is. Baumrind and co-workers, followed up by other investigators such as Slicker and Guzak here, they looked at the outcome. So this is a very large study looking at the outcome of people in college age, how they turned out. And they did a survey of these students to get an idea as to what kind of home they came from. Were they raised with absent parenting, permissive parenting, authoritative, or authoritarian, okay? And they looked at, the parameters they looked at was number one, proficiency. What is proficiency? How well do you do academically? How well do you do in the work world, okay? They looked at self-esteem. They looked at capacity for long-term relationships and subjective happiness. Now, what you'll notice is that authoritarian and authoritative are clearly the best. Permissive and absent are low in proficiency, self-esteem, capacity for relationships, and subjective happiness. I mean, even so, these are kids who did not get a lot of, oh, you're wonderful, and yet their proficiency is almost as high as the people from authoritative parenting. Where they have lower scores is over here subjective happiness, okay? They're still about as happy as the permissive parenting, but look at capacity for long-term relationships. That's a big thing. And even self-esteem is higher than in the permissive group. And so when they tell you that the worst thing you can do is authoritarian parenting, I beg to differ, okay? The evidence suggests otherwise, all right? Ultimately, authoritative parenting is the best. But, yeah?
Are there studies that would say, for those that would argue against authoritative or authoritarian, are there data studies to back?
There's studies where they specifically look at things like subjective happiness and self-esteem and stuff. And so you look at that, and it's about the same. But they would have you believe that it's much worse. And, and so they cherry-pick their studies in that regard. Okay? Yeah?
How important is it to grow up in a Christian home?
It's good. That is a very, because it really depends. You have to subclassify. What do you mean by Christian home? Ultimately, it's important to keep in mind God will never take away your free will. And just because you grow up in a family where you have two Christians, that can look very different from point A to point B. And so it's too broad of a question. And I really couldn't even give you that answer. I think overall, it's clearly better. I think you have an advantage there, but our free will is always going to be a part of this, all right? So clearly, if you're growing up in a Christian home and you're following Christian principles, biblically, the biblical model is authoritative. That's the biblical model. The Bible tells us to know our children and to not make them exasperated, okay? And so the Bible supports authoritative parenting style over authoritarian, okay? So if what you mean by a Christian home, then big time total advantage if this is what you mean by a Christian home. Not all Christian homes do that though, okay? Because Christians come in all flavors, from mature to immature and so forth, okay?
You said before that a lot of millennials especially, they don't believe in God, so then they don't have any hope, so then they try to fill the void.
Yes, that's very true. And that's